It's my great pleasure today to introduce you to Bendor Grosvenor, director of Philip & Mould and Company. Bendor studied English history at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and the University of East Anglia, and he joined Philip Mould in 2005 and oversees the gallery's research, cataloguing, and acquisitions. He's a member of the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Council on National Records and Archives and the Lord Chancellor Forum for History, Manuscripts, and Academic Research. Bendor has made several important discoveries of lost works by artists such as Gainsbourg, Lawrence, and Anthony van Dyck, on whom he's an acknowledged expert. He regularly published books and articles on history, art history, and current affairs. And his talk today is Why Connoisseurship Matters.
Thanks very much. Ooh, lights. Can everybody hear me all right? Is this working? Yes? Only just. How about that? My nightclub crooners. Is that working? Bit of feedback? Right. I think perhaps I ought to start with a quick definition of what connoisseurship really is. Although it sounds fancy and is loaded with sort of preconceptions we've heard about earlier this morning, and it sounds quite rarefied, it is in fact a very basic concept. It comes from connaisse in French and in turn cognoscere in Latin, which means to get to know. So connoisseurship is all about getting to know the work of your chosen artist or artists so well that you can recognize their work much like you would recognize a piece of music by your favorite composer, or recognize the author of a letter not by the signature at the end after you've turned it over, but the handwriting on the envelope when you get it. Sometimes it really does happen almost in an instant or a blink. Other times, usually when there are questions of condition involved, it takes a little longer. But that's really all there is to it. The connoisseurship I'm talking about today isn't about wider things such as taste, and I hope we don't have to get into why attribution or authorship matters. If it doesn't matter to you that the Mona Lisa was painted by Leonardo da Vinci, well then you're probably at the wrong conference. As a dealer who tries to make his living by spotting misattributed pictures at auction, I'm regularly surprised by two things. First, just how unsettled the art historical canon is. We may think we all know who painted what, but actually we don't. Of the over 200,000 oil paintings in the UK's national collection, for example, some 20%, that's 1 in 5, either has no attribution or an uncertain attribution, and you can bet that many more have a wrong attribution. And secondly, I'm surprised at just how few art historians are really able to recognize the artist of a particular painting. I don't mean to denigrate art historians as a whole, I count myself as one, merely to express my surprise, given how many art historians and art history graduates there are out there these days, that the ability to make attributions or practice connoisseurship is so little practiced. I find it astounding that one can look at the online collection of a major British museum and see works which are by a major artist but just called Circle of so-and-so. And even that some museums seem to revel in the safe catch-all of English school, for example, and appear to show no curiosity at all about the actual artist, as if they didn't matter. It's a bit like living in a world where doctors are all fully trained and have passed their exams and can write diligent papers on all manner of diseases, but cannot actually make a diagnosis. Perhaps the best way to illustrate why I think connoisseurship matters is to give a brief demonstration of what happens when it goes awry. And I think I don't share Stephen's optimism earlier. It seems to me that sometimes we're in danger of going too far the other way in the anti-connoisseurial direction. And to use that old cliche, we may be in danger of having thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And so this doesn't turn into a Bendor Grosvenor Son de Lumière, I'm going to try and do this without mentioning pictures that I've been involved personally in buying, either myself or with my employer, Philip Mould. This picture was deaccessioned by a museum in the United States, the St. Louis Art Museum, and offered at Christie's in New York in 2010 as a work by a follower of Van Dyck. The picture was spotted by my fellow dealer Fergus Hall, who believed that it had hidden virtues. And he was certainly right, for conservation revealed that the picture had been substantially overpainted. It is in fact a study for Van Dyck's now lost large portrait, The Magistrates of Brussels. The study Fergus found will soon, I gather, be going on display at the Frick as part of their exhibition in 2016 on Van Dyck's portraiture. In other words, not only is this painting indisputably by Van Dyck, but it would be a useful addition to any museum's collection. So why did St. Louis sell it? How would we feel if a British museum sold it? It seems in this country we're slightly immunized from such feelings because here we tend not to do deaccessioning. But that might change. Regional museums are now selling works with increasing regularity, and we cannot afford to be too complacent. Here's another case, a slightly more ongoing one, and it's from a much larger museum. The Metropolitan Museum in New York is a keen deaccessioner, and for that reason, beloved of dealers like me. The Met recently decided to sell this study, which used to be recognized as a rather important picture by Rubens, but which in the 1970s, late 70s I believe, was doubted by the Rubens scholar Julius Held. The picture was offered at Sotheby's in New York last year as by a follower of Rubens and described as portrait of a young girl, possibly Clara Serena Rubens, the artist's daughter. It had an estimate of $20,000 to $30,000. This is a drawing of Clara Serena in the Albertina by Rubens. And I think the technical term for spotting the similarity between the two is a dead ringer. I and many others were struck by the sheer quality of the Met's picture, which was covered in quite a thick yellow varnish and a degree of overpaint. It's beautifully painted, and for me it sparked that immediate light bulb moment that here, in fact, we were dealing with a work as all the old provenance literature had it by Rubens himself. It seems inconceivable to me that someone else in Rubens' circle would paint this unique and intimate portrait of his daughter in his style and so well, and it is, of course, simply too good to be a copy of a lost original, which is a phrase which in auction catalogues brings joy to the hearts of dealers like me. It doesn't match immediately our immediate impression of what a Rubens formal portrait looks like, but that's because it isn't a formal commission. It's an intimate study not meant for public eyes. Now, at the auction, the picture fetched $625,000. I and many others in the trade believed it to be by Rubens himself. I haven't seen the picture cleaned, and I don't know what the official verdict of it is today, or whether it has been accepted by art historians at the Rubenianum in Antwerp, the Centre for Rubens Studies. But I have to say I suspect it will be, once people see it cleaned. And if so, then the Metropolitan Museum will have made a catastrophic error and sold what really should be one of Rubens' most impressive smaller portraits of his own daughter for not much at all. The obvious question will therefore be, even if the Met was unsure of the picture's attribution, why did they take the risk of selling such an obviously attractive, if dirty, picture just to raise a potential $20,000? What happened to that institution's collective sense of connoisseurship, the ability to look beyond the label, to look through the yellow varnish and assess the picture's quality on its own merits? Well, I believe it failed. Now, you might wonder why the bidding stopped at relatively little, if the picture really is a Rubens and potentially worth a few million quid. What I can tell you is that the picture, I suspect, would have fetched far more at auction had it not been for a certain anxiety amongst the trade that Rubens scholarship at the moment is, shall I say, somewhat unpredictable. Although people in the trade firmly believe the picture to be by Rubens, they knew that the chances of getting an endorsement of that attribution by some Rubens scholars was in fact quite slim, and so the picture represented a greater than usual commercial risk. The Rubenianum is an interesting body to discuss with regard to connoisseurship. It is, I should say, an invaluable institution, perhaps the best in the world for the study and publication of research on an individual artist. But in terms of connoisseurship, you could say that it has some potential weaknesses. The authors of the Catalogue Raisonné are a fairly disparate group, unlike the Rembrandt Research Committee, in which final decisions are taken by one well-established connoisseur, Ernst van der Wettering. The Rubens Catalogue is a many-headed beast, with different researchers given different areas, such as portraits, head studies, religious pictures, and so on. Some of them are excellent, and their volumes are models of their type. But to be honest, others cannot tell the difference between a Rubens and a hole in the wall. An example of where Rubens scholarship can be a little uncertain is in this picture of Sir Anthony van Dyck on display at the Rubens House in Antwerp, which I thought I would choose today to illustrate now that the UK has its very own freshly minted portrait of Van Dyck. For me, this picture is an open and shut portrait by Rubens, although it's in slightly compromised condition. The hat has been massively overpainted. And it has long been recognized as Rubens' own portrait of Van Dyck when he was working for him in his studio. Happily, most of the Rubenianum scholars recognize this picture as indeed a work by Rubens. But, ladies and gentlemen, it seems there are dark forces afoot who are determined to take this picture away from Rubens and give it to Van Dyck. Now, normally, I'd be delighted to see Van Dyck's iconography gain another self-portrait. He's my favorite artist. But this picture shows up how easily undermined attributions and connoisseurship can be when it goes wrong. And in this case, it has been partly undermined by science. It's become fashionable of late to say that connoisseurship has to work hand in hand with science in order to arrive at an attribution. But in fact, I don't think we're there yet. Often, science can in fact lead us down entirely the wrong path when it comes to making an attribution. This portrait of Van Dyck, for example, has recently been analyzed by synchrotron radiation. And this revealed, I'm quoting, another image beneath the paint surface, which was very similar to other self-portraits by Van Dyck. Well, it strikes me that this is clearly nonsense. And the interpretation is based on an impossibly small sample size. How many other early Van Dyck portraits, yet alone other Van Dyck self-portraits, earlier ones, of which is only one, have been radiated by synchrotron radiation? How can we make a sample size? We're now in the crazy world where traditional connoisseurship is rejected in favor of an entirely arbitrary and untrained type of connoisseurship practiced by scientists looking at paintings beneath paintings. And anyone who's trying to interpret an X-ray will know how difficult it is to try and be a connoisseur of a painting beneath the painting. But because it's a verdict by scientists, it seems we must accept it as valid. The Van Dyck portrait was also tested with 3D imaging devices in what's called a mini-dome, which apparently has 25,000 light bulbs and takes a picture like this. This apparently revealed, and I'm quoting from the news report, that by looking at the brushstrokes on the surface of the painting, the researchers found that it had been built up in layers, continually revised during its creation, a technique associated with Van Dyck. Art historians know that he continually rethought his composition and technique as he went along. Rubens, by contrast, did not. He would paint according to a preconceived plan, not revising his earlier work, meaning that his brushstrokes would show up entirely differently under 3D examinations. In other words, it's more nonsense. But it seems to me that we haven't yet amassed nearly enough data to start making these sort of blanket binary assumptions that some scientific analysts like to make. We can only really begin to make comparisons via synchrotron radiation and 3D minidomes after we've synchrotron radiated every picture in Rubens's oeuvre, and Van Dyck's, and so on and so on. The same applies to things like paint analysis. Have we really taken enough samples from paintings of all ages and of all types to be 100% confident in its use? The pigment Naples yellow, for example, was thought to be in use in the 18th century from the 18th century. But now it has been identified in the 16th century. So any pictures ruled out by previous analysis must now be ruled in. So while the use of scientific analysis in attributions is still in its infancy, let me make a plea that we should still retain the primacy of what we might call traditional connoisseurship. Science can usually help you find out what a painting is not. It can point to something being a later fake, for example, but it cannot, or at least it can only rarely, tell you definitively whether a specific artist painted a specific picture. We may be able to prove scientifically that Van Dyckian pigments were used on a Van Dyckian canvas in a Van Dyckian composition, but that only leads you to the certainty that a work was painted in Van Dyck's studio, and there's plenty of them. To be able to determine whether it was painted by the master himself, we need, and always will, need the connoisseur's trained eye. Now, I've selected just 3 pictures so far by 2 artists I'm familiar with. But what I think they help show is that even for big-name artists, some of the world's largest museums and centers of research are in danger of occasionally, not always, very occasionally, but those occasions are important, losing their way. And my case is that surely art history can do better than this. But before I suggest how we might do better than this, let me quickly look at how we've got here. And here I need to be frank about connoisseurship's weaknesses. I was recently asked to advise on connoisseurship for a new play about to open in the West End. It's called Bakersfield Mist, and it stars Kathleen Turner. She was big in the 80s in films like Jewel in the Nile. And Ian McDermott, who's best known as the Emperor from Star Wars. And that was a great moment for me, meeting the Emperor from Star Wars. The play is all about a connoisseur called Lionel, who's going to see a possible Jackson Pollock bought in a junk store for a few bucks by Maud, who lives in a trailer park. And I was asked to attend a rehearsal with the actors to tell them about how a connoisseur assesses a painting before he makes an attribution, or she makes an attribution, and to tell them about connoisseurship, or as Maud calls it, when she's told that her Pollock isn't by Pollock, horseshit. One of the main things Ian McDermott wanted to know was whether a scene in the script where his character assesses the painting in a blink was really how it works. Did it really work like this, he asked. How do you know, just by looking at a picture, who painted it? Surely there must be more to it than that. Unfortunately, I had to tell him that there really wasn't. And that's the rub of connoisseurship. Connoisseurs claim to know just by looking. But how do we explain that thought process and that certainty? As one of the leading connoisseurs of our time, the author of the Pastel Dictionary, Neil Jafaris, has said, the light bulb in a single connoisseur's head is invisible to the rest of us and indistinguishable from self-delusion, except by inference from that expert's track record. And as a result of this potential for self-delusion, connoisseurship has, over the last 30 or 40 years, it was a skill which used to be an essential foundation of art history and has now become something of an endangered species, easily dismissed, and its practitioners occasionally made objects of suspicion by those who choose not to do it or cannot do it. The pendulum of art history has, as Stephen was telling us earlier, swung away from the close study of the object, in which connoisseurship was key to the study of its context, be it social, political, or economic, and has swung even away from the focus on individual artists in a headlong quest for generalization. Consequently, connoisseurship, for many reasons, and this alone, this as well, has a bad press these days. As one art historian brave enough to be working on a catalogue raisonné said to me recently, connoisseurship among some of her colleagues is referred to as the C word. And there are other reasons for this damning of connoisseurship. Of course, things aren't helped by the fact that one of connoisseurship's last redoubts these days, as we heard earlier from Johnny Yarker, is in the art trade, where it's practiced daily by dealers like me. But at least that has the benefit of being able to define a proven or otherwise track record. Then there is the undeniable problem of plain bad connoisseurship, which I'm sure Martin will tell us more about shortly. First, there's corrupt connoisseurship, a la Bernard Berenson, and then there's just misguided connoisseurship, with attributions given by well-meaning scholars who simply do not understand, perhaps, for example, questions of condition. In some cases, corrupt and inept connoisseurship can combine to create the perfect connoisseurial storm. In 1988, the late Professor Eric Larson, who was at a university in California, wrote a Van Dyck catalogue raisonné, which was so bad it even had a fake Van Dyck self-portrait on the front cover. It seems clear that he took cash for attributions, but not that it seemed to matter, because for a good decade, Larson's catalogue was held up as the backbone for all Van Dyck scholarship, because amongst the wider public and many auction houses, not enough people knew about Van Dyck connoisseurship to realize that Larson was at best hopeless. And charlatans like Larson can show that once a bad connoisseur gets their hands on an artist, then the whole oeuvre can be misunderstood for a generation. The Van Dyck situation wasn't corrected until the publication by Yale of their own catalogue raisonné in 2004. But still these days, some publishers of catalogue raisonnés make the mistake of not first seeing if their chosen expert is suitably qualified to be connoisseurally reliable on a chosen artist before they give them the publication gig. It shouldn't be hard, it seems to me, to have some kind of basic test. But I think the main reason connoisseurship is in something of a crisis is because the essential element of being a connoisseur isn't appreciated or encouraged enough anymore, despite occasions like today and Mark and Stephen's earlier optimism. And that is, of course, the art of close looking. Put simply, many art historians and their students do not get out enough. Academic art history has retreated to the classroom to be taught from small images in books or on screens. Too many art historians spend more time discussing and debating pictures, sometimes in impenetrable psychobabble, than looking at them, and I mean real nose-to-the-canvas looking. Of course, there are glorious exceptions, as we've heard. York is doing marvellous things under Mark's leadership. But often, the more senior an art historian becomes, in fact, the less time he or she spends looking at pictures themselves. As the art historian Ben Street wrote recently in Apollo, perhaps in the rush to lend art history additional academic ballast, something has been overlooked. the honing of a visual literacy, the intellectual act of looking at original objects. This kind of looking, primary, immediate, and responsive, he wrote, seems to decrease as one ascends the academic ladder into the quiet and dusty attic of expertise. And those of us who have tried to get experts to pronounce on pictures will recognize some of that. That's why it seems to me that connoisseurship's centre of gravity has now shifted towards the art trade, because we're the ones who spend our lives looking obsessively at pictures, not just good ones, but bad ones, things in good condition and in bad condition. One of the best ways to learn to identify a Rubens, for example, is by looking at endless copies of Rubens. Good ones, bad ones, later ones, period ones, as well as studio replicas. Then the real thing in its luminescent quality becomes much more easily recognizable, almost indeed in a blink. It's my contention that not enough art historians do this, and so their connoisseurial radar becomes flawed. How then can we start to restore faith in connoisseurship again? And why does it matter that we should all get out and look more closely at art once more? I don't mean just go and stare at canvases in a museum. I mean really roll your sleeves up, go scrupulously through the racks in your museum store with a torch and a magnifying glass, spend time in conservation studios seeing pictures stripped down, and understand what isn't overpaint. Go to auction houses and look not just at the good pictures, but just as usefully to put them into context the bad ones. Everybody should do this, not just curators, but undergraduates, restorers, lecturers, and professors, and not just for the odd day of the year, but all the time, as much as possible. And the good news is, anyone really can do it if you give it enough practice. It's not that difficult, and above all, it's good fun. See, I believe that connoisseurship can help us learn so much more than simply who painted what. How useful to be able to discern where the hand of Rubens ends and that of his studio assistant begins, when such things are rarely, if ever, documented. Connoisseurship is not just about spivvy dealers like me trying to make a quick buck. Connoisseurship matters because art historians and museums are sometimes in danger of becoming detached from two of the most fundamental purposes of their job: to help preserve our heritage and to accurately inform the public about the pictures they're looking at. If we don't get that right, then everything else art historians like to do, from contextualizing to interpretation, falls apart immediately. And I believe that the success of the new crop of television programs and news stories which try and demonstrate who painted what, which invariably rely on some form of connoisseurship, demonstrate that this is actually what the wider public really want to know. I'd like to end on that last point about preservation. And in my roundabout way of trying to offend, or actually not trying to offend, but resulting in offending everyone, every genre of art history, I'm now going to include conservators. Because one of the areas I think that we suffer from a lack of connoisseurship is actually in conservation. Conservators are often brilliant technicians, but they sometimes have not a clue about the technique and style of a particular artist. I've seen restorers adopt an identikit approach to paintings, as if they're painted in a uniform way and could be cleaned and restored as such. But that, of course, is rarely the case. On many occasions, I've had to stand over restorers and point out, for example, that Van Dyck painted this or that way and that this or that glaze isn't, in fact, overpaint but original paint. And to show why I think that connoisseurship has such a valuable role to play in conservation, let me end with what is probably the most single important painting in Western art history, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. I recently went to Rome and saw the ceiling for the first time, and as I was standing underneath it with my binoculars, being jostled this way and that by the crowds, I'm afraid I got a terrible shock. I always used to think that critics of the Sistine Chapel restoration were being slightly myopic or a little bit obsessive, and that trained restorers, surely at this level, were infallible and couldn't possibly damage pictures. But how wrong I was. The Sistine Chapel has been subjected to the most brutal overcleaning imaginable. I don't mean the exposure of the bright colours which we see looking so nice here, which most people fixate on, but the actual removal, through simple abrasion with solvents and a rough sponge, of the crucial darks and shadows which gave the ceiling so much meaning and form. Though we don't have time to go into the debate here as whether Michelangelo worked as secco on the ceiling or purely in fresco, it seems to me that the whole approach to the cleaning of the ceiling was fundamentally misunderstood. But my contention is that if the restorers had in fact been real trained connoisseurs of Michelangelo's work, and were not just pure technicians, and had a feeling and an eye for how Michelangelo intended his pictures to work, they might not have made the same mistakes. And I don't think I can really make a greater example of why connoisseurship matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bendor. I think it's better to keep questions for the debate afterwards. So our second speaker is Myrone. Martin joined Tate in 1998, and he has worked on a range of exhibitions and display projects at Tate Britain, including Gothic Nightmares in 2006, John Martin Apocalypse in 2011 and 12, and William Blake's 1809 exhibition in 2009. He's the co-curator of the forthcoming Tate Britain exhibition, British Folk Art, that opens on June 10th. He was founding co-convenor of the Tate Research Centre British Romantic Art between 2010 and 2013, and co-investigator of the Tate University of York research project Court Country City, British Art 1660-1735. As lead curator, British Art to 1800, he works with a team of curators and assistant curators responsible for the research and development of the British collections from the 16th to the early 19th century. And please join me to welcome Martin. Today he's talking about the limit of connoisseurship. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I just adjust this? There you go. Is that going to be okay? Does that sound okay? I'll start speaking. All right, my submitted title for today was The Limits of Connoisseurship. I missed off an S in my email. I do believe there's more than one limit to connoisseurship, and that was reflected in my original title. In the last day or two, I had a quick rethink and thought, actually, my title might be a little bit more emphatic. It should be Connoisseurship, So What? I'm told because of the kind of all the webbiness of today, I'm not meant to swear, but you get the inference. Connoisseurship, so what? Because as much as I was delighted to be part of today's conversation, very flattered to be invited to join, I also have a kind of a reservation in the back of my mind. I kind of wonder, what are we talking about today? What are we really talking about today? And that, I think, is what I'm going to try and work towards in the comments I'm going to make over the next 20 minutes or so. I've organised my comments around three kind of capsule case studies. I'm not going to give much detail, they're just kind of little snippets drawn from the experience of myself and my immediate colleagues at Tate and from our routine work as curators. Two are research issues relating to the collection, the third is acquisitions related, and all three concern late 18th century British art. I'm going to swiftly run through those capsule studies twice. The first time round, I'd like you to consider the question of what sort of skills, knowledge, activity is involved, and what of those skills, knowledge, and activities can properly be considered under the rubric of connoisseurship, and only under that rubric. Is the term actually useful? Is the term actually meaningful? Second time round, I would like to think, perhaps a little bit more contentiously, about whether connoisseurship even matters in each of these cases, and if it matters, in what way. And that will lead me to my final comments and the bigger question at stake here, perhaps, which is less around the value and validity of connoisseurship in itself, and rather around the value of even asking the question of its value and validity. Who is asking the question, and why? To take a quick step back, and by way of a preamble, I feel like, as other speakers today I doubtless will, I should position myself. I am an almost stereotypical product of the so-called new art history of all those years ago, the 1980s and 1990s. Although my working life has been in the context of national museums, I trained initially at UCL, very much in the shadow of the still relatively newly founded Oxford Art Journal, one of the kind of the organs of the new art history, which a number of the staff there were closely involved with. Postgraduate studies at the Courtauld Institute of Art with David Sulkin, who's been mentioned already today, a job on the British galleries at the V&A during its early planning stages, and then a job at the Tate just at the point it became Tate Britain. In all those contexts, there was, quite definitely, a sense of a new historical and curatorial practice being set against the old. This was played out discursively, but also at an organisational level and in strategic planning. Connoisseurship was not a term which was actively used, at least in a positive sense. If connoisseur and connoisseurship were referenced at all, it tended to be either in a strictly historical sense or with a kind of broadly negative inference. The resistance to the term, and at least some of the values associated with it, found focus in at least two ways. Firstly, in challenging the primacy of connoisseurship over other art historical methodologies, and the idea that establishing authenticity was a sufficient end in itself. Secondly, there was resistance to the overly neat distribution of art historical practices across different sectors of the field, with connoisseurship the absolute province of the museum, where it may be allied closely to the art market, and social and contextual art history absolutely the province of the academy. The connoisseur, insisting on the sanctity of art, was one of the cast of characters that the youthful director of Tate Britain, Stephen Dukar, outlined in his contribution to the Clark debate on the two art histories, I think very kind of important seminal debate, published a few years later, I think it's 2006, along with the academic, the curator, the educator, and the museum director, all equally exasperated with one another. Stevens was a balanced account, and there has been nonetheless a more widespread tendency for these caricatures to circulate, and a temptation perhaps to place them in an overly neat chronological framework with a pattern of succession and displacement, thus giving rise to the language that we've heard something of today of crisis and decline. Put simply, it hasn't always been this way. It used to be much better. It was better in the olden days. At the last academic event I attended here at the Mellon, Connell Shields mentioned in passing the entrance space to an exhibition that he worked on in 1976, the Tate of Constable, and the presence there, which you can see these slides, of a biscuit tin decorated with Flatford Mill. And there's the, I guess you were still typing captions in those days, a kind of hand-typed caption accompanying it, raising a kind of very kind of reflexive way the question of Constable's reputation and reproduction. Now this shows a little curatorial gesture which I think quite elegantly opens up questions of taste, reception, reproduction, and cultural value, all you might think elements of a new art history long before anyone would have considered it as such. Similarly, William Vaughan's 1970 exhibit at the Tate around William Dobson's Endymion Porter, that's the painting on the far right in this plan of the show, has near legendary status as a contextual didactic exhibition, including lots of text panels, lots of text, prints, there's a gun, there's medals, coins, all sorts of stuff in order to explore the context and meaning of this painting. Lots more stuff than I think you can see in any exhibit currently at Tate Britain. I personally doubt that there was ever a golden age of curation, simply arising from and embodying the pure values of connoisseurship, at least as far back as there was any sort of alternative available. To turn then to my capsules. The first is a picture I've bored several people in this room with over the last couple of years. It is, or at least purports to be, a likeness of Edward Warpin, the parish clerk of Bradford-on-Avon, painted somewhere around 1760 to 1770 on the basis of the age of the sitter. A simple public inquiry from someone writing a study of the sitter's son, an organist in Bath, prompted a re-examination of this picture in the Tate store. It's been in the National Collection since 1867, when it was purchased for the National Gallery at the Wiltshire sale. The provenance, and even at that early date, more than a half a century of exhibition and literary reference, established that this work was by Thomas Gainsborough. It remained at Gainsborough, at the National Gallery, and then, after transfer in 1919, the Tate Gallery, for the next 90 years. It wasn't just any Gainsborough in that context, it was one of Gainsborough's very greatest pictures. This is a kind of mock-up of a hang that was current at the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square in the last third of the 19th century, where we see Edward Orpin on the left, paired with Sarah Siddons on the right, with the watering place in between. This hang drew particular commentary. It's a kind of a stock feature of guidebook commentaries and an art historical commentary, seeming to present a neat trio of the painter at his best: his greatest landscape, his greatest female portrait, his greatest male portrait, neatly arranged. This is how things remained all the way through to 1958, when Ellis Waterhouse, in his catalogue of Gainsborough's works, demoted it on the basis of what he had seen in the 1953 Tate exhibition of Gainsborough's paintings. That move was heretical enough to elicit a separate, dedicated note on the subject at the very front of his catalogue. And if you look at his 1958 catalogue, there's a little note right at the beginning saying, look, I'm sorry, but this isn't Gainsborough, and I have to, lots of works aren't Gainsborough anymore, but this one, I need to tell you, is not Gainsborough. That, we might say, is a triumph for pure connoisseurship. For everything else about this picture, its exhibition history, its provenance, its institutional history, its reception history, all conspired to say this really should be a Gainsborough. Connoisseurship has not yet, though, been quite so successful in suggesting a believable alternative, and I'll come back to that point. The second case study happens to be another painting associated with Gainsborough in the Tate collection. This is a small oil landscape of a generic idealized countryside, acquired by the Tate in 1958. Waterhouse did consider this to be a securely attributed work of about 1770. When the painting was examined, conserved, cleaned, and researched, on arrival at the Tate, the curators were less sure. Technical and formal observations by Martin Davis, the assistant curator at the National Gallery looking after the British pictures, recorded in notes kept helpfully on file, questioning the attribution, mainly around, he was very bothered by the sheep. He didn't think the sheep were very good. These are kind of blobs of sheep rather than very convincing sheep. And the construction of the tree trunks, you can see to the left there and to the right, it didn't quite ring true. It was designated manner of, and has remained so to this time. John Hayes, in the 1980 catalogue of the landscapes, refers to it as perhaps the most deceptively close to Gainsborough's style and technique of the many imitations and pastiches of Gainsborough's work. A media inquiry a few months ago opened up the question again. On the basis of our file records, a re-examination of the work, and several conversations, the question of attribution was, though, left unresolved. The picture appeared, I'm told only fleetingly, in an episode of the popular TV programme Fake or Fortune. I have not watched it, but I'm told, somebody reported that this is seen on the racks briefly. There is, clearly, more work which could be done about this picture. The third work is a picture that we were able to acquire a year or so ago, a pastel, initially identified as a John Russell of an unidentified sitter. Having taken an interest in the purchase of this work, we pursued research into the identity. In a sequence of events I can't fully recall, in quick succession we widened our checking of the mounts at the wit. We asked Neil Jafaris if he recognised the painting, the pastel, and heard from the vendor with the same result, that the work was in fact to be identified as an Ozias Humphrey, and had once been sold as such, identified as an African prince in 1909. From that point, we were able to then take further work, drawing out compelling technical and formal resemblances between this work and documented Humphreys, and filled out the ownership history, taking it back to Humphrey's illegitimate son, William Epcot, and we also re-identified the pastel as a portrait of the running footman of the Dutch ambassador in exile in London in the 1790s, Baron von Nagel, and this work is now on the wall at Tate Britain. So, happy ending. Now, in each case, there are things which happened which you might call connoisseurship, in that they involve judgments based on visual experience and technical understanding rather than documentary data, and because there are, arguably, questions of taste and value in play. But it would also be perfectly possible to describe each of these episodes without referencing connoisseurship at all. Indeed, we might observe that the work of identification, attribution and evaluation undertaken here is of a wholly mundane nature. It is everyday work, nothing to shout about unless you are particularly intent on claiming the limelight for some reason. And there are other things going on. Connoisseurship would allow an only very partial understanding of any of these works. Going back to Orpin, the question of attribution is clearly an important and interesting one. It has helped determine whether this picture has been on display or in store, and it has been on store, as far as I can tell, since 1958. But is the question of whether this is by Hoare, or Hone, or Beech, or Pine, all names, among others, that remain in the mix, anywhere near as interesting as the question of how this work could spend 150 years as one of Gainsborough's greatest works? That's the greater issue, and connoisseurship gets us nowhere near it. It doesn't allow us to even start thinking about this. In the case of the landscape, I'm sure there is more work to be done. We have a provenance extending into the 19th century, and it might be that our state of knowledge about Gainsborough's technique would allow us a more definitive view than was possible in the 1950s. But in these straitened times, at least among the national museums, can we really make this a priority? Even if we felt able to secure the attribution to Gainsborough, I'd be inclined to ask, again, so what? So what? We will have gained a small characteristic. We do not have limitless resources, and we do not have limitless time. We need to make decisions about what comes first, what we do first, where we put our time, where we put our money, where we put our resources, and where, I can ask, does the authority for making those decisions lie? Not, I would hope anyway, with the makers of Fake or Fortune. Then, thirdly, the Humphrey pastel. That bit of work around attribution and identification adds to our knowledge of the picture. But it does not answer all the questions which you might properly ask about it. If, in another context, we wanted to look at this work as a representation of a black male servant at the end of the 18th century, how relevant would the questions that connoisseurship address be? Does it matter that it dates from the 1790s? Well, yeah, probably yes. But it does matter that there's the context of revolution and revolutionary Dutch campaign against the slave trade, the status of this, etc. All of that's important. Does it matter that it's a work by Russell or by Humphrey? Probably not at all. Perhaps marginally, if we consider the relative status and cost of works by these artists at that time. Instead, by not addressing the question of race and of representation, we would do the work and our public a disservice, and we would diminish this work as a work of art. Still, I think there is hardly anyone who would dispute the basic value of establishing date and authorship. The question of quality is perhaps that much more tricky and can hardly be ignored in a museum context where wall space and money are limited resources. But what weight you give to that issue of quality is another matter. And assessing a work as of greater or lesser art historical significance, or greater or lesser visual interest, in the context of a display or acquisitions planning, and is assessing a work as of greater or lesser value in the context of a display or an acquisitions planning really something that could only be described as connoisseurship. I noted in the latest art newspaper, Martin Kemp proposes that we don't use the word connoisseurship, we talk about judgment by eye, because it allows the practices associated with connoisseurship to be tied much more closely to technical art history and conservation science. So he's suggesting, there's a different way of talking which actually brings disciplines together in a positive way. And then also, why do we need to believe in the connoisseur as an individual who carries all those skills in his head or up his sleeve, in the pocket of his pinstripe suit, or up the sleeve of his genteelly worn cardigan if it's the weekend and he's in the country? Why close ourselves off from the reality which we see every day working institutions of collaborative working and shared knowledge? In fact, there is evidence that we have reached a sort of entente, or at least we believe we have, and we've heard from Stephen pointing towards that this morning. The editors of the Sotheby Institute's Art and Authenticity volume said as much, referring back to the exhibition A Closer Look, Deception and Discoveries at the National Gallery in 2010, where they suggest connoisseurship and other art historical methods seem happily to sit side by side. Now, I'm quite certain myself that this sort of stasis or entente is illusory. I'm probably as doubtful as Bendor perhaps that there's the potential for this kind of loving. We're going to hug each other and be delighted with each other's opinions. Instead, there is an active and ongoing struggle for relative authority between the different parties who operate within the field of art history in the wider sense, because that is how the world works. We could and should be more explicit about that, however. With all this in mind, we then have to ask why there are those who would insist on the primacy of the term, who want to believe and want to resuscitate connoisseurship. And beyond that, ask who those people are and what stakes and investments are involved. And this, perhaps, to push the point, takes us into uncomfortable territory. For it might lead us to do what we don't do, or at least don't admit we do, when we sit in a room like this and look forward towards the speaker and say, well, who is that speaking? With what authority do they speak? Where do they come from? There's a moment in Mass when you're invited to look around to everybody who's sitting. You have to shake hands with everybody. I'm not suggesting we actually shake hands. But you could do that thing, which we don't do in these sort of academic events, because academia and the academic discourse kind of closes us off from the world, supposedly, which is where we look around and we say, are they wearing a suit? What sort of suit is it? Are they wearing a tie? What sort of shoes have they got on? What accent are they speaking with? Where do they come from? How are they educated? Because that is all part of how we position ourselves in the world, and it's all part of how we perform in the world, and it's all part of how we put in motion affiliations and allegiances, which are important because it's part of what gives us or takes away from our authority. There is a crude dividing line, crude but important, a line in the sand perhaps, which marks a point on a spectrum leading from interest to disinterest, the private to the public. And I should be absolutely clear at this point that I am not saying that someone active in the commercial world cannot be disinterested, public-spirited, outright generous. They can be, and fortunately often are. Nor that someone working in the public realm, in a public gallery, most obviously, may not have selfish or commercial interests. They may. But there is a difference nonetheless. At the end of the day, we have to suspect that connoisseurial judgments in the commercial realm are made with an eye to making money. Maybe not immediately, maybe only in a deferred way, maybe only as a result of the kind of reputational gains which may be made. But that is their motivation and their reason to exist. If they deny it, then their clients and investors really should be told. Even putting that to one side, it is absolutely the case that the disinterestedness, the sense of public duty, which may be espoused by a commercial gallerist, is an elective disinterest, an elective sense of public duty. And it matches, in a way that I think should be unsettling, a tradition of kind of patrician activity. The disinterest and the sense of public duty of a work in a public museum is, or at least should be, a contractual obligation. It's our job. What is at stake right now, I think, is much more than the rather slight matters arising in connection with the particular practice of connoisseurship, that mundane skill set which, if more thinly and irregularly distributed than was once the case, remains of pretty indisputable value. What is at stake is the relative authority of the commercial and public sectors. We have reached this point of supposed crisis and renewal. We have reached this point less perhaps because of any decline in standards or corruption of art history than because because the economic and political support for a public art history and art history pursued in the name of the public has been so much under attack. And I fear that any champions of connoisseurship are, whatever values they may espouse, more likely to be part of the problem than the solution. Thank you.
I also think it's pretty clear that you've got very different ideas of what art history is, and you know, the degree of relationship between the discipline and social practices. So I'm just going to ask other questions. My first question, and then I'll open, of course, the questions to the public, is the relationship between connoisseurship and language. Connoisseurship is the practice of naming artworks, and at the same time, connoisseurs usually are quite, let's say, they resist the practice of articulating and verbalizing what they see. I mean, you before said that the comparison between the two Rubens were self-evident, and many other connoisseurs, from Bernard Berenson to, you know, Federico Zeri, they usually don't explain why certain images look the same. So I wanted to know whether you can elaborate on that. And then, Martin, the same question is to you. I mean, in a way, you redefine connoisseurship as part of the daily practice of curators and art historians. So, and this involves also the practice of naming things as part of the research process. So I just wanted to know what you both think about the problematic, you know, articulation of what you see in a painting.
Yeah, well, it's a very good point, and it's something I try to be frank about in my paper, that I think all connoisseurs find it difficult to articulate how that light bulb comes on in our head. And part of the reason I try to stress the importance of one's track record is that seems to be one of the few ways that we can begin to, because essentially we have to trust the connoisseur, we have to trust connoisseurship, because it is so difficult to communicate. It's a purely cognitive reaction. I mean, it is once you stand in front of a picture and once you try and break it down, it is possible to explain about brushstrokes and things like that, but it's never very satisfactory. Quite often I like to focus on the more obvious signs of originality and spontaneous creativity. So, I mean, you know, things like pentimenti and the vigorousness of how something is painted is more easy to convey than trying to say, well, this looks like how Rubens painted, and I can tell you that because in my mind I'm flipping through my mental Rolodex of 20 other Rubenses from the same period I've seen. Now, give me an hour and I could probably bring them all up on a screen and show you, but it's still a difficult process.
I think that the question of the limits of language and the limits of words as a means of describing, embodying, responding to works of art, I mean, this is kind of obviously a huge area for thought. I mean, I noted, I mentioned Martin Davis' report in 1958 of that Gainsborough landscape, which is very detailed in saying there's something wrong with the painting here, something wrong with the painting here, but he ends up saying, it seems rather difficult, we have found it somewhat difficult to put down in writing points which would probably be obvious to a person looking at the picture, right? So there's almost, and that is the kind of the scene of connoisseurship, as it were, that without documentation or without being able to translate into words readily, there is just something which is wrong. Now, why, and I don't know, you know, it's such a big topic, I don't think it's easy to take a position on that other than, you know, saying, oh, it's about subjectivity. Because clearly it isn't just about subjectivity, but it is about risk. Because that brings in an issue of risk and it brings in an issue of authority. So the question then becomes, well, will you, as the person responsible for that painting, whether it's as a buyer or a seller or as a kind of custodian, will you take the risk of staking, sort of working with one opinion or another? And I think there is a kind of inequality between different fields about where the level of risk that you're able to take. And I'd say in a public museum, that risk is we're much less ready to take risk. But it does, as I say, does also bring in that question of relative authority. I mean, who is going to make that judgment, and what stakes and investments are involved in that judgment? And I guess having one of the things that the new art history training of the 80s and 90s did to perhaps a whole kind of generation of scholars is raise the question of whether the pursuit of pure disinterest in a purely disinterested kind of academic practice is even feasible.
I'm reminded slightly of Churchill's comment on democracy. He said it's the worst form of government till you consider all the alternatives. You could probably say the same about connoisseurship. It's the worst form of attributing paintings until you look at the other ways of doing it.
Thanks. I'm asking the questions about language because it seems to me that we moved away from, let's say, a Morelli-inspired connoisseurship, you just look at brushworks, outlines, earlobes, and hair, to another form of connoisseurship that tries to unearth then this sort of like representational, compositional schemes that try to enter into the minds of the painter and try to understand why he or she would have made those particular choices, including those attributes, thinking about the architectural framework and so on. And so that's why language becomes particularly difficult. Roberto Longhi in the 30s already was talking about representational facts. It was talking about the fact that he could see connections between paintings, even if the style was very different, the brushwork, I mean. And mostly because the brushwork sometimes is also subject to issues of functions. An artist can change the style, the brushworks, whether, he's aiming at, high or lower audience and so on. So the issues of language, of how to articulate these sort of invisible forms, and not just brushworks, becomes a particular important one.
Well, the composition can only take you to a copy or a studio version. It can't take you to the real thing. To determine whether something is by the master, you need to examine their application of the paint. That's the only way to do it.
I think the other thing we might do is go back to the point that Annie made earlier on, which is to distinguish between attribution and connoisseurship. It seems to me that the component parts, what I was perhaps suggesting or trying to suggest in my comments there, is that the component parts of what makes up connoisseurship, you could pick apart and call them other things: attribution, authentication, sitter identification, all those other things that you do, which get clustered under the term connoisseurship. What connoisseurship seems to represent is not those skills, not those activities, not those things that we do, but rather a set of values which gloss over and connect those activities in a good sort of Marxist sense, mystifying gesture.
Are there questions from the public?
Michael Daly from Art Watch. Can I say, I feel like a dog between two bones here. Both of the talks were, for me, immensely interesting. I left art school in 1968 and went on to the New Left. And I never expected, when I set off to come here today, that the class war would be so alive and so proactive.
I'm not wearing a cardigan.
That was you, wasn't it?
There should be such dissension and such antipathies within the art world. The notion of connoisseurship is, it seems to be seen with a certain distaste in one sector of the art world, and which is suspicious of the other sector. The distinction between the art trade and the museum world or the academic world is essentially misplaced and bogus. From the perspective of an artist, and I think there are no artists speaking today, everybody is in the art trade, in the art business, whether they're academics or curators or dealers. And the really interesting question is, to what extent should the interests of social theory and class warfare or whatever impinge on our understanding and appreciation of art? And Bendor Grosvenor, it was absolutely correct to say that you can distinguish, you can tell the difference of one thing from another. The quarrel that I would have with Mr. Grosvenor is that he's leaving out one of the biggest distinctions, or has just finally addressed it in the case of the Sistine ceiling. The differences between restored works and not restored works can be as great in terms of appearance as the differences between this member of a studio and another member. There are lots of things that are not being addressed, but the essential point that it matters to be able to tell one thing from another, I think, is indisputable. It can't be gainsaid. And anybody who has ever taught in an art school knows that you learn to distinguish very quickly which student did which work in a large group. You do that within weeks. Students don't have to sign their works. You recognize them all. So people in the business do have this ability to tell one thing from another. And it does matter, I would suggest. And I think it matters rather more than social theories, which come and go.
Martin?
I don't disagree, and I think I did in the course of my commentary. I did say, I suppose the central point, I might as well restate it, is I think you would find it really hard now to find anybody who would absolutely come out and say questions of attribution, sitter identification, and dating do not matter in the practice of art history. Right? You could probably imagine certain sorts of imaginative art historical practice where those things don't matter, which is much more to do with response or aesthetic response or so forth. But that's a pretty kind of marginal area. I think what I would observe, both through my own training and experience, is that the idea that people have never been looking at pictures for the last 30 years, or the idea that there's this vast chasm between art history as it's practiced in museums and in the academy and the commercial sector, I just don't recognise it. And I think making the point that there's this vast chasm becomes itself very politicised. And I think it's made, I'm not sure where it's coming from a lot of the time.
Well, can you tell us what was the nature of the distinction you seem to be pains to make throughout your talk? You seem to be talking about disinterestedness on the one hand and social relevance on the other. Wasn't that the gist of your paper?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Disinterest, I can't say it now. Disinterest is the quality of the judge, right? Whether the judge, whether a judgment is made out of a sense of public duty and a sense of disinterest, or whether it's made in a marketplace context. And that's the distinction I was drawn between the public and the private, between the interest and disinterested.
But what does that reside in? In the commercial sector, you can say, oh, well, dealers have got an interest because they can turn a penny. Yeah. Curators have interest. They can turn a penny. They can build their reputations. They can jet around the world. What's the force of the distinction in real terms, in the real world?
The force of this, and I did say that, I think it'd be kind of utopian to imagine that museums and academic departments don't involve questions of personal preferment and development and so forth. But at the end of the day, we are obliged, it's kind of written in law in terms of freedom of information, in terms of our obligations and our duties to act in the public service. And that's not true in the commercial realm. They may choose to, but they do so electively. And that is a distinction. A kind of elective disinterest is a complicated idea.
Yes, there was a question here.
What I was fascinated by was, actually, Martin, you answered a mass of questions that I was going to ask the previous speaker, which surely, in the world in which we live, which everybody wants a return on the money that they put in, you have the benefit, Bendor, of being able to spend, you have a sixth sense. I'm not saying that in the public sector they don't have a sixth sense as well, but you have the luxury of time and funding to investigate much more deeply, rather than on private funding, rather than the public funded museum, which has to answer to many, many criteria. And I would just suggest that there is a place for it everywhere. A sixth sense is something that also you may have initially, but you develop it by constantly looking infinitely deeply at one specific thing, which in the public sector they do not have. I don't know whether other people agree, but I just think that's the division between the two, that you probably will get a better return on your money than the public sector will. I don't know.
I'm not really sure what to say. But I mean, on the time question, certainly I have the luxury of being able to spend weeks on one painting when, I don't at all blame colleagues in auction houses or museums for not getting things right all the time because they have so little time to look at each picture. So I recognise I have a luxury in that regard. However, I don't think that should preclude museums from taking a keen interest, and almost that public duty is more overriding to correctly inform the public of the pictures in the national collection. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the work of weeks and weeks to recognise a picture. Well, I don't know if it's necessary. I mean, there are staff issues, of course, but just to pick Tate's example, the Tate Britain didn't help itself recently by losing, in unfortunate circumstances, experts on two of our leading British painters. So, it seems to me that, maybe I'm thinking in a slightly OCD way of trying to order the world and say we must know who did this and who did that, but I think there's an overriding public duty to inform the public of what they own. And particularly, as I say, we don't have in this country deaccessioning, but that is one case of where it can go horribly wrong if we don't take care to know what we do have.
No, there was a question here in the front. No, in front.
My name's Fergus Hall. I'm a dealer in cardigan carrying would-be connoisseur. I certainly try. I'm fallible, as I think we all are. But a couple of the points I wanted to raise with the panel. I suppose in terms of the financial interest of a dealer, I suppose that clearly there is a financial interest for a dealer. And but I think it's important to say that dealers rarely sell off major works without having a further independent expert opinion. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to the current discussion. Although perhaps it may be the difference between an art dealer and a museum curator is a bit like the difference between a chicken and an egg in a bacon and egg breakfast. The chicken is interested, but the pig is committed. That is to say that there's quite substantial penalties for being wrong as a dealer. That is to say the ultimate sanction being that you go bust and you disappear. And so there's a certain Darwinian process by which bust dealers stop being problematic because they've gone under, and good dealers survive because you have to be quite good. But the other point I wanted to make is because I've got a lot of sympathy, Martin, even though I think I'm on the polar opposite in my heart with your point. But I do agree with you that connoisseurship doesn't need to be mystical, and I think the key point there is I believe connoisseurship is ultimately a banal skill, but like running the 100 meters in 9 seconds is a banal skill. But not many people can do it. So I think it's like anything else. You've got to have some certain natural ability, and you've got to work at it. If I trained 10 hours a day and was 20 years younger, I still wouldn't be able to run the 100 meters in 10 seconds. Some people are good at it, and some people are less good. That's just life in almost any skill set one can possibly imagine. And I think it's ultimately about empiricism. It's about natural ability and working at it, and the working at it bit is really about empiricism. And so the blink instinct, which Bendor talks about, and he's right, so often it is a blink. It's a sort of, yes, I know it is by blogs, but often, and this hasn't been talked about, it's not always a blink, because sometimes you've got an early work, so it's juvenilia, it's harder, he hasn't become himself yet, or it's a late work where he's either deteriorated or got better. His eyesight might be bad, he might be painting with his fingers, what have you. In which case, so the middle period picture that's a good quality, good condition is an easy blink issue. But there's a lot of issues around early works, late works, and poor condition works where you have to use what Daniel Kahneman discusses as he's read a seminal book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he's a Nobel laureate, a Nobel Prize winner. And I think connoisseurship is just like that. Your series 1 thinking is the blink instinct, and your series 2 thinking is engaging analysis, and what you're quite rightly talking about breaking it down. Because quite a lot of it's objective, and before I must finish this rant, but just as a fellow Van Dyck and Rubens lover, along with Bendor, to give an example, a lot of confusion is arising around early works and distinctions between Van Dyck and Rubens. But a lot of it can be unpicked in an objective way, not purely subjective. And I think the muscular connoisseurship is the marriage of the objective and the subjective. So to take Van Dyck and Rubens, the objective would be to say, because I entirely agree with Bendor's comment about the portrait of Van Dyck, is clearly by Rubens, Rubens is hotter and wetter and smoother than the young Van Dyck. Van Dyck liked texture. He normally painted on canvas or paper. Rubens painted on panel. Rubens' palette is hotter, and it is wetter, and Van Dyck's drier. And a lot of these issues, once you know those objective assessments, a lot of the confusion that's recently arisen seems entirely unnecessary. Anyway, here I shall end that. But,
Thanks. Actually, I would like to intervene now. I think considering connoisseurship and like the training of the eye as a natural activity like running may be a little bit dangerous, because if you follow the debate between connoisseurship about Chinese paintings, Western and Eastern scholars completely disagree, because they look and describe and define artworks in completely different ways, and they can't agree on basic connoisseurial issues. And it seems to me that these distinctions that you make between subjective and objective is an important one, but something that has not been very well articulated. And it's very difficult to understand, besides the technical aspects, like whether it works on panel or use oil as a binder. And, try to be quite as sophisticated when it gets to the subjective qualities of an artwork.
But it is ultimately empirical, because it ultimately, even if you say people disagree, but
you say people disagree, and of course they do, but it ought to be possible to come to a sensible consensus on the basis ultimately of empiricism.
I think we have also witnessed some scholars working on the idea of objectivity, where they found that even the notions of objectivity is culturally related. So for me, it's becoming difficult to accept an idea of objectivity and empiricism that is defined, solid, and unchanging. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm actually hugely sympathetic to most of what you said there, and thank you for kind of refining and adding to what was clearly kind of polemical points in the context of my own commentary. I suppose the point which I was one of the points I was trying to make, and which I would return to now, is that slow thinking, quick thinking, the blink of the eye. I kind of understand all that, and that question of who has those skills, and demystifying them, but acknowledging that they do belong. Some people are better than others, right? Absolutely in sympathy with that. Absolutely right. But there's a couple of questions arising from that. One, which is who gets the opportunity to make those judgments, and what weight is given to those judgments. And it isn't just to do with whether it's a Van Dyck or not, or whether it's a Gainsborough or not. There are all sorts of other forces which get involved there, and we need to be aware of those forces, right? It's not to say we don't make those judgments, it's just kind of aware of the forces in play, so we understand where those judgments sit within a kind of a larger world that we all live within. That's one thing. And then secondly, yes, we can apply slow thinking, quick thinking, blink, stare, and decide whether a painting is by one artist or another. But there are other questions you can ask about that same painting, where that question of attribution may possibly not be as important. So it isn't an end to itself. It is very important, and I think almost everybody's going to say it's important, but what weight do you give to it, and what end do you see it working towards is a slightly different question.
Not much more to add, really. Just that I think we are, as I said, we are in danger of losing that. Although we now seem to be all agreeing it is a good thing, but we're in danger of losing that fundamental foundation because not enough students are currently practicing it and being taught it.
Following actually this point, what do you think about these sort of extra forces you were talking about, both of you, which is this sort of like cultural baggage, the fact that our eye is somehow dependent on a social phenomenon and is culturally trained?
There's a great thing called scopophilia. Has anyone heard of scopophilia? The critics of connoisseurship came up with this one, which is apparently the practice of looking at a painting from a subjective male point of view and judging it, saying this woman is not pretty enough in this picture, and so it was a great stick to beat connoisseurship with. When if you could give it a philia, and everyone, of course, oh my God, pedophilia, scopophilia, and all that kind of thing. So yes, some people are quite determined to beat up connoisseurship from that point of view.
My response to that would be, is baggage the right term? Because baggage suggests there is a pure, instinctive I, which is then loaded with something which is exterior to it, which is, the world. Whereas actually, it's a kind of Baxendalian question, really.
It's about construction of the eye.
How far that eye is already made. And in contemporary debates about whether this painting is by this artist or another, we kind of put that to one side. We can deal with that when we're talking about the 17th century or the 18th century. But it's actually dealing with it in terms of our reflexive practice, I think is a bigger challenge, but it is also important because it has real ramifications as well.
I do wish we'd all get a little bit less angsty about things. Art historians, we love to wring our hands and say, oh, but what about this and what about that? And I think we should all just relax a bit and not be so worried about values and class and what jumpers or cardigans we're wearing. Just focus on the object. As Fergus said, it's all about empiricism. Let's get back to looking straight at the painting, close up.
Of course, you're espousing a position which betrays your own position in that.
I mean, I like the idea of relaxing, but at the same time, we cannot be naive about, what are questions? There are many. There's one there, just behind you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Pat Hardy from the Museum of London, Curator of Paintings, Prints and Drawings. Given the comment that was made, I think, in the first talk about the now primacy of the visitor and the audience experience, I just wondered what our two speakers thought about that and the importance of attribution stroke connoisseurship on the display of pictures in galleries, in permanent displays and exhibitions.
Notwithstanding present company, I was a little bit critical of the Tate's much vaunted rehang because I thought, just having a label which says this is by so-and-so and it's of this isn't enough. I'm an old stick in the mud. I think it's not, the public's reaction to a picture is not more important than what the picture is, what the picture can tell the public. I don't believe that at all. And I don't believe that most people go to museums to have some kind of Alain de Botton-esque art therapy moment. I think most people go because they want to be informed, sort of Reithian principles, perhaps. There's a picture by Kneller in the Tate rehang, which is painted in Germany before he came here, and it's a religious subject. And someone going along to the British Tate might think that it's an important part of British art history, but it's painted before he ever got here. And because the label doesn't say anything about that, you're left slightly in the dark.
The question of those elements of a work which might come under the heading of connoisseurship's purview about dating and identification, that is, even when we strip out as much interpretation as possible, that still remains a thing which you provide, and which I think there's the assumption, the expectation that any visitor needs that as a hook, as a point of reference. So I think that's terribly important, and I suppose that there is a question which I don't know. I mean, other people have addressed this through displays and through curatorial work. There is a question of what I'm referring to as kind of mundane, everyday curatorial work, actually communicating that better to a larger public, because maybe it's more interesting than we think it is, actually, and taking the opportunity to communicate and relay that. It might be something that we collectively could do more of.
I suppose it just begs the question when we've been talking about curatorial resources, and shouldn't therefore we be devoting more time to that if that's what the expectation of the public is, that they need to know what every artwork is?
Yes.
Yes.
There was a piece of work which I don't think I portrayed anything, but there's been a piece of research on the use of online resources at Tate, which I was reading through just a couple of days ago. And it turns out that most people visit the collection website in order to find out information about works of art. And what they want are pictures and more information about the pictures in the collection, which is quite heartening, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Susan Willis, and what I'm hearing in this wonderful morning is that we need to pay attention to what Stephen was referring to, which was the subject of collaboration, because we have great knowledge and great skill in curators and great knowledge and skill in dealers, and everybody has the same vested interest to help the public love art, live for art, appreciate art, buy art, collect art, give it back to museums, let the public share it, understand it, and love it. And if there's some way for people in different fields of art to work together on projects or exhibitions, it would be a wonderful thing for everybody.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly, and that's why I think we should have, and this conference is one of Martin's post-mass shaking hand moments, so well done to Mark and Martin for putting it on. I would just point out one specific thing, and I don't mean to pick on Tate, sorry Martin, it's Tate policy at the moment not to endorse or comment on attributions of pictures brought to them by members of the public or people in the trade. And they came to that conclusion, I don't know, I suppose I can't speak for them, but for fear of being involved in filthy lucre. Now, other museums, the National Portrait Gallery and the National Gallery, don't have that policy. But it seems a shame to me that the leading repository of knowledge of English paintings in this country, British paintings, refuses to comment publicly on new discoveries, and I think that should be redressed.
Which Clementine Kerr Christie's. I was actually about to raise myself, thank you, Bendor, and I wanted to ask Martin if he could comment on that policy. My experience certainly is that curators are equally frustrated, some of them, that they're not able to talk openly with auction houses and dealers about their opinion. It seems to be mutually beneficial. We contact experts to ask about pictures that aren't necessarily going to come to the market. They might be remaining in private collections, and it's a wonderful opportunity for them to, to see a wealth of pictures when they're dealing with a fixed collection. And actually, in other cases, I contacted a curator about a picture which has ended up in a public collection. She was frustrated that she was told, I think there had just been an extra drive that curators really shouldn't be speaking to auction houses. And she said, if she had just had the opportunity to work on this picture a bit, she would have been able to establish quite how important it was. And she said that she would have actually requested that this be something that Tate acquire, which they then didn't have the opportunity to do. So, yes, I'd love to know the rationale behind it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I can comment on a kind of Tate policy issue. I'm not kind of briefed to represent Tate in this context. But what I would say more generally, I suppose there's two things in response to that. One, which is the question of risk again. And public institutions are risk averse, and generally risk averse in many of their activities, and kind of need to be, because if we get it wrong, then it's public money and public time which is being spent, and there is an authority which comes with an institution, almost regardless of who is actually populating that institution and what kind of cardigans they wear and so forth. So there's that question of risk, which I'm sure is part, along with the kind of commercial question, is part of any thinking behind that broad policy. So that's one thing I would certainly say in response to that. And secondly, and this is a very general point, it's not to say kind of in reference to that particular policy, strictly defined. And I'm feeling now, maybe I'm just getting old. I've been getting old. And
Martin, you look great.
Well, I'm not the young gun anymore. There's a slight sense that there's a language of public service and a language of public duty, which we're at risk of losing among the national museums and at risk of losing in the public sector, mainly in reference to commercial activity and the economic pressures that are on us, and the need to undertake income-generating activity and kind of rationalise ourselves in that way, but also in a funny way because of the language around access. And as you might imagine, there are many of the principles of access in museums which I hold very dear and have been kind of inculcated into my way of thinking. But there's a kind of fixity on numbers and on mass audiences, which perhaps arguably has kind of risen to the fore at the expense of some, perhaps rather old-fashioned sense of duty and public service. That we're very public-facing, and quite rightly very public-facing, but there are other things which need to sit alongside that as well.
Yes, there was another question in the back.
Well, is this in response to this? Yeah, okay. Well, Martin, you're probably well placed to comment on this, actually. Yeah.
Sure.
Having spent 8 or 9 years at the Tate and being allowed to give opinions was actually very important. I thought it was an important component of what I did. And in terms of whether you call it connoisseurship or attribution, I learned an incredible amount by the fact that I was able to answer questions, see objects, whether they were private or owned, that belonged to a dealer, and that, in a sense, helped me build up my data bank. I still do it now today at the Melbourne Centre because I'm allowed to do it, and I think my world would be visually and intellectually impaired if I didn't have that ability. I think it's very important for curators to have that, and also to be able to give opinions and to ask opinions as well from the trade. I think that's important too, because as Bendor has stressed, there are dealers, people who work in auction house who have that expertise. And I would be very happy as a curator to have someone from the trade to come and talk to me about work of art in my collection if they were best qualified to do so. That's just my opinion.
Thanks.
Splendid.
Hi, my name's Charlotte Woodhead from the University of Warwick. I'm coming from a completely different point of view because my research is actually in the law to do with art and heritage. And the thing that struck me really was the theme of authority that you were talking about and who has the authority to make these decisions. And I think it links very closely with this idea of public duty as well and recognising the need to correctly identify particular works for the public benefit as a whole, but I think it also links as well to private individuals who own works as well. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts in terms of the authentication boards and those people whose approval you have, or authentication you need before you can actually sell a work of art, and the fact that views may change over time, and so really it's that sort of idea about the link not only to the public benefit of identifying works, but also to the effect that it can have on individuals, and linking that back to authority in sort of sorting that out. And whilst in the UK there's not the same problem of sending your painting off to an authentication board and it may be destroyed, there are issues that may arise, and I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that.
I think maybe Bendor might be for you.
Well, I do get very anxious about authentication boards, actually, because it's slightly taps in what Martin was saying earlier about who we can trust. The authentication boards, lead to restriction of connoisseurship and understanding and expertise, because they become quite quickly little fortresses, and who have to guard their own reputation. In some cases, especially with modern artists, they have to guard their own stock, their own inventory. And the article that Martin mentioned by Martin Kemp in the art newspapers, that he's busy, it seems, and I know others are as well, trying to come up with some sort of structure for authentication, and we can tick a box, and once we've ticked the 3 or 4 boxes, we can decree a work to be by Rubens. But I would resist that very strongly, because I think we should try and collaborate as much as possible and have Martin's view at the Mellon Centre and Martin's view at the Tate and Christopher Brown at the Ashmolean, and everybody should be able to contribute to an authentication.
You have a question? Yeah, I think we're going to the microphone, please.
Thanks. This sort of related to an earlier point in the discussion, but I think it actually sort of comes back. Many people have described the connoisseurial skills as something sort of banal or everyday, and I agree with the point about demystification. And actually, there is a sort of wonderful tradition, English tradition, going back to Jonathan Richardson at the beginning of the 18th century, who was very keen on the idea that people could learn to be good connoisseurs, and I certainly agree with that as a person in education. Having said that, I don't want to undersell the very interesting things that it could lead to thereafter. And it seems to me, Martin, your talk, I would read your first example rather differently. You said, rightly, I think, that the question of why people accepted that portrait as a Gainsborough for 150 years is an absolutely fascinating question. Although maybe the question of who else it might be by is also quite an interesting question. But wouldn't we need some skills of the kind that, I don't know, you could call it the judgment of the eye, or you could call it connoisseurship, or whatever you want to call it, but you need some skills of that kind in order to address that kind of question, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Or,
Because then there was the question of judgment of what were they actually seeing.
Yeah,
it's probably
absolutely.
going back to that question of a kind of a period eye as well, and thinking what is what we see now, what they saw in 1900 or in 1867. So Brian is jumping out of his chair.
Well, yeah, I say one thing in relation to that portrait. One of the reasons that it remained in Gage Reserve for such a long time is because we knew nothing about all the figures around it. For what it's worth, it's by William Moore of Bath. And I say that because I say it.
Yeah. Well, that's. I'll note that for the file, Brian.
You could say I've got no authority to say that because authority is a word that we fear, and we live in a world of the anarchy of the internet, and so it makes it even harder for anybody to claim to have authority. And it is loaded with all the things you say, Martin. I accept that, but it's precisely because no one bothered to look at all the diaspora around Gainsborough. And that when early catalogues are done, everything gets thrown into the pot by the major artist. And until you unravel that, this is exactly what Bendor's been talking about and others. And that needs to be done still. But no one wants to do it anymore because it's discouraged, it's seen as a lesser species of art history, and so on and so forth. I merely make that observation on that one particular picture. I could say things about the third picture as well, since we sold it to you, but I won't.
Well, maybe over lunch.
We're running a bit over time, but there are two questions, so if you perhaps can keep them quick.
Yes, Martin, I hugely enjoyed your paper, and I think you're absolutely right to call into question the disinterestedness of certain portions of the trade. So I sort of want to pose a general question, which, as a member of the trade, I would be extremely nervous to see the authority of attribution entirely resting in individual members of the trade. I therefore think that the Academy and museums have a responsibility to retain a degree of authority, to be able to have the final say on works of art and on their attribution. And therefore, something we should be asking ourselves is how do the Academy and museums take some of this responsibility back?
I don't think I'm not going to answer that, but I think it's absolutely the right question to be asking at this juncture. I think it's a very good question. I think it does. When I said at the beginning, I said, there's the connoisseur and the connoisseurship, and some people want to talk about crisis and decline, and fine. But there's something else going on as well, and I think that shift in authority and the shift in resources, and the question of kind of resource and time and application is perhaps what's sort of sitting under the surface of this debate, notwithstanding the merits of the debate on its own terms. And I think it is to do with where does authority lie, and where judgments get scrutinised and assessed, and the slippage there between connoisseurship as a set of practices, which can be broken down probably into elements, maybe not as mechanistically as some people would push for, but it can be broken down into certain elements, and the connoisseur as a figure. And I think we've got to be careful to distinguish between them, and the advocacy of the qualities of connoisseurship ends up too quickly also being an advocacy of a certain kind of character or caricature.
And there's the last question, right?
Thank you. My name's Joss Hackforth-Jones, and I'm based at Sotheby's Institute, and I really want to reinforce what the last few questioners have been saying, and that is that while I think connoisseurship might be the wrong word, educating, I can't overstate what I think is the significance of educating the eye in the academy, and part of what we do in some of our MAs is what we call the object-based approach, as indeed do Christie's Education and the Courtauld. And I think what I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is hearing this sense from experts that knowing the authorship of a work is something that can be done in the blink of an eye, because educating art historians in this field is a time-consuming and serious process. And we find, for instance, in our MA in Fine and Decorative Art, that the students are intensively exposed to the artwork, both the front and the back of the artwork, to conservation, to scientific processes, to thinking about fakes and forgeries. It takes a long time to build up this expertise. But one of the things that always interests me is that when students move to an extended piece of writing, like a dissertation, that they then don't trust their eye, that very often they move into what their comfort zone, which is probably doing something more conventionally art historical. So I guess what I wanted to do was just make a very strong case for educating the eye as part of the broader approach within the academy that works alongside other art historical methodologies.
Very briefly, it's Annie Lars again. You didn't ask me if I could have one more question before lunch, but I'd just like to mention something else which I think is very important. We've been talking about the trade versus the museum as if it is a kind of versus. One needs to think back to the time when Evelyn and Joel from Agnew's actually did a joint catalogue with Martin Butlin from the Tate, and think how much scholarship in general and the wider cultural context of that has benefited from that Turner catalogue. But also what I wanted to say is that when I trained at the Tate and learnt about Constable, who's notoriously difficult in terms of connoisseurship, I was enabled to learn a lot by seeing pictures that were brought in by the trade as well. And I mention this because now I no longer work at the Tate. I'm called on for that expertise, which was in effect a publicly funded investment in a member of staff. And I'm now giving back in the widest sense, especially to public bodies like the Heritage Fund. Indeed, if I may add, the Art Fund, who at the moment have a particular case that hinges on attribution. It's entirely confidential, of course. But I think it's terribly important that we understand that if we can all work together and pool our skills, it ends up going back in for the public good. And, if these objects are acquired with public money or money raised through charities, then the public benefit again. So it is a whole system that goes round in a very beneficial circle.
Mm. Yes, here. And if I can have a little, I did restrain myself very much in my paper by not showing any personal discoveries, but if I can have a boast, that my proudest moment was finding a Van Dyck in the storeroom of the Bose Museum, which had been overlooked for centuries. And now it's there, I think, one of the most visited pictures.
Well, I'm sorry I have to cut this, but it's time for lunch. We're already running over time. But please join me to thanks Bendor. And I suppose we convene again in 1 hour.